There's a record from the Black Forest, a single colony in a standing oak, that went 11 consecutive winters without a beekeeper touching it. The colony didn't just survive, it thrived, brewed in spring, honey stores through fall, population stable year after year. 11 winters, no treatment, no inspection, no harvest pulled from it, just a tree and the bees inside it. The question most people ask is whether that's even possible. That's the wrong question. It happened. The record exists. The right question is what we've built since then that made it impossible. If you've kept bees for any length of time and something about that bothers you, it might be worth staying with this one. And if this kind of history is useful to you, the kind that changes how you look at your own equipment, there's more of it here. Worth subscribing if that's what you're after. The forest hive that survived those 11 winters wasn't an accident. It wasn't a particularly strong colony or a mild string of winters. It was a specific cavity in a specific tree, built to specific proportions. Proportions that had been refined across several hundred years by men who understood something about bees that most modern beekeepers have quietly lost. Those men were called Zidlers, not beekeepers, tree wardens. The distinction matters more than it sounds. The Zidler Guild operated across the German forest regions, the Black Forest, the Harz Mountains, parts of what is now Bavaria, from roughly the 13th century onward, with their practices reaching full elaboration by the 16 and 1700s. They were licensed, regulated. In some regions they answered directly to the crown, because forest honey and beeswax were taxed commodities, not hobbyist products. But here's what made them different from every beekeeper who came after them. They didn't manage colonies. They selected trees. A Zidler's primary skill was reading a living forest for cavities that matched a precise biological profile. Height off the ground, aspect, which direction the entrance faced, species of tree, because oak and beech aged differently and held moisture differently, and above all else, internal volume. The hollow had to be right, not approximately right. Right. When a Zidler found a suitable cavity, he would mark it with a guild sign carved into the bark. That mark was legally binding. It meant the tree, and whatever colony eventually occupied it, belonged to the guild. He might check on it once a year. He might take a modest cut of honey in late summer, through a small access hatch cut low in the trunk, designed so the upper brood nest was never disturbed. Then he would close it and walk away. The colony didn't need him. That was the whole point. Every intervention a modern beekeeper makes in spring, every single one, is solving a problem the log hive didn't have. Swarm cells on the bottom bar. The log hive didn't swarm at the same rate. Chalk brood on the inspection board. The log hive had a pathogen environment the bees controlled themselves. Moisture on the inner cover. The log hive managed its own humidity through propolis architecture that modern beekeepers scrape out twice a year and call it maintenance. None of that is an accident. All of it connects back to three variables that the Zidlers understood through observation long before anyone understood the biology underneath them. The first is cavity volume. A wild honeybee colony, left entirely alone to select its own home, will occupy a cavity of roughly 40 liters. This has been measured. It has been verified across multiple studies in multiple countries. When researchers went back and measured surviving historical log hives, the ones still in German forest museums, the ones documented in guild records, they found the same number, within a few liters, every time. The Zidlers didn't write down 40 liters. They didn't measure in liters, but they knew the tree, and the tree was 40 liters. Below that threshold, say 30 liters or less, colonies experience constant swarm pressure. The nest fills too quickly. The queen runs out of laying space before the nectar flow peaks. The bees read the situation correctly. The cavity is too small, winter survival probability is low, and the biological imperative shifts from honey storage to reproduction. They swarm again. Some years they swarm 3 times and still don't make it to February. Above 50 liters, a different problem emerges. The colony can expand freely, but the winter cluster can't generate enough heat to maintain brood nest temperature across that volume. The bees contract toward the center and the outer stores become unreachable. They starve surrounded by honey, not from lack of food, from geometry. The wall thickness isn't insulation in the way most people think about it. This is where it gets specific, and where most beekeepers have never really thought it through. Insulation slows heat transfer. That's one function. But 3 to 5 inches of dense oak or beech heartwood does something beyond that. It buffers, it absorbs heat from the cluster during active periods and releases it slowly during cold nights. It dampens the temperature swings that force the cluster to continuously recalibrate. The colony isn't fighting the cold. It's living inside a thermal mass that moderates the cold for it. A modern Langstroth box, even well insulated, is 7/8 of an inch of pine. The colony inside it experiences every ambient temperature change within minutes. On a cold March night that drops 20 degrees between sunset and midnight, the cluster in a pine box is working hard just to hold position. The cluster in a standing oak barely notices. That matters for brood. Not just for adult survival, for brood. A brood nest that cycles through temperature stress produces fewer viable workers per comb cell. The math compounds across a season. By August, the colony that spent March fighting thermal swings is measurably behind the colony that didn't. Here's the part that stops most people when they hear it. The Zidlers didn't harvest much honey. A guild record from the Harz region in the early 1700s documents annual yields that would make a modern commercial beekeeper wince. Modest amounts, nothing like what a productive Langstroth setup generates in a good year. That wasn't failure. That was the design. The log hive was not optimized for honey production. It was optimized for colony survival, which, over time horizons longer than one season, is a different calculation entirely. A Zidler who kept 20 marked trees and pulled light harvests from each of them for 40 years was working a more stable system than a beekeeper who maximizes extraction and replaces winter losses every spring. The yields were lower per hive per year. The losses were also lower. The Zidler was not in the business of high output. He was in the business of continuity. Modern beekeeping reversed that priority. And with it came the losses that now get treated as normal. There's one number the Zidlers never wrote down, but that explains almost everything. And it brings together the volume, the wall thickness, and the third variable, which is entrance geometry. The entrance of a surviving log hive is small, consistently small. Not because large entrances are wrong in summer, but because the entrance is the single interface between the colony and the outside environment. For air, for pathogens, for moisture, for thermal exchange. A small entrance, at the correct diameter, allows the bee population to fully guard it. Full guard coverage means varroa mite introduction via drifting drops, chalk brood spore infiltration drops, small hive beetle pressure where relevant drops. The bees don't need a beekeeper to manage these pressures. They manage them at the door. That entrance also affects ventilation in a way that the propolis architecture amplifies. A colony in a tight cavity with a fixed small entrance will propolize the internal surfaces, the rough inner bark, the irregular cavity walls, in a specific pattern. They seal the cracks that create drafts, leave the channels that allow controlled airflow, and coat the walls with a propolis layer that has measurable antimicrobial properties. The cavity becomes, over 2 or 3 seasons, a biologically active environment that suppresses the pathogens the colony is most vulnerable to. When a beekeeper opens that hive and scrapes that propolis, even with good intentions, even to clean the equipment, they are dismantling a system the bees spent 3 seasons building. The 40-liter threshold, the 3 to 5 inch wall, the small fixed entrance. These 3 variables, aligned, created a colony environment that didn't require management because it didn't generate the conditions management is designed to fix. The colony in the Black Forest that survived 11 winters was not exceptional. It was just living in a correctly proportioned cavity, and nobody interfered with what it built inside. This is the part worth sitting with, not as an argument against modern equipment, but as a diagnostic. When you open a hive and find swarm cells, you are seeing a colony that has outgrown its space or lost confidence in its ability to survive the coming winter in its current location. The correct question isn't how do I manage the swarm impulse? It's what is the cavity telling the colony about its survival odds? When you find moisture damage in February, you are seeing a ventilation system that failed. The bees couldn't pupillize correctly because the surfaces were too smooth, or the cavity was replaced too often for the propolis layer to establish, or the entrance geometry created pressure differentials the bees couldn't compensate for. When you find a colony that draws well in spring and dies in November with honey in the box, you are very often looking at a thermal mass problem. A colony that burned too many bees maintaining cluster temperature across surfaces that couldn't buffer. None of these are failures of the bees. They are design mismatches between the biology and the equipment. The Zidlers solved those mismatches before they understood the biology. They didn't have the vocabulary for propolis microbiome, or thermal mass, or swarm threshold volume. They had observation, and they had centuries to refine it, and they had the discipline to walk away and let the system run. What they left behind, in the museum log hives, in the guild records, in the surviving dimensions of marked forest trees, is a template that has been largely ignored by modern apiculture. Not because it doesn't work, because it doesn't scale, and it doesn't sell equipment. That is a different problem than whether it's true. There are beekeepers working today, mostly in Europe, some in the American Northeast and Appalachian regions, who are returning to these dimensions. Smaller cavities, thicker walls, fixed small entrances. They are not replicating the Zidler forest hive exactly. They're building modern versions that incorporate the same 3 variables. The results being reported are consistent: lower winter losses, reduced swarming, less intervention required per colony per year. It doesn't look dramatic. It doesn't generate the kind of yield numbers that make a commercial operation viable. But for a beekeeper keeping 10 or 15 colonies, trying to reduce losses and reduce the workload that comes with compensating for design failures, the math changes. The question isn't whether you should tear out your equipment and build log hives. Most people reading this won't. The question is which part of what you're already doing is compensating for not having one, and whether understanding that changes how you think about the interventions you reach for every spring. The colony in the standing oak didn't survive 11 winters because it was lucky. It survived because nothing in its environment was asking it to solve problems the environment had already solved for it. That's not a secret. It's not a forgotten trick. It's just design. And it's worth thinking about the next time you pull a frame and wonder why the bees seem like they're always working against you. If any of this connects to something you've seen in your own hives, a colony that did better than expected when you left it alone, or one that fell apart after what seemed like a routine inspection, that's worth sharing below. Those observations are more useful than most research papers.